Good evening. My name is Lisa Carrico, and I'm a program director for Missouri Humanities. We are a member-supported organization dedicated to enriching lives and strengthening communities by connecting Missourians with the people, places, and ideas that shape our society. At their core, the humanities explore how we understand and connect with the human experience through our histories, cultures, and traditions. While the humanities are significantly tied to museums and historical societies, events like this one, which celebrate language, storytelling, and shared experiences, are also deeply rooted in humanities. Thank you for joining us for our annual reading celebrating the release of Proud to Be, Writing by American Warriors, Volume 13. Since 2011, we have partnered with organizations across the state of Missouri to provide veteran service members and military-connected families with opportunities for self-expression through our writing. Our veteran programs include writing workshops, this annual publication, and events like tonight's reading. These programs encourage hundreds of veterans to tell their stories each year. This year's volume features 45 contributors from across the nation who have shared their military-related experiences through essays, fiction, poetry, and photography. These creative works offer deeply personal perspectives of the complexities of military service, sacrifice, and duty. These stories honor veteran service, deepen our empathy, and remind us the role military service plays in our shared humanity. By sharing these stories, we gain a richer understanding of the past and present, fostering meaningful dialogue, discovering common ground, and strengthening our connections. Tonight, we'll hear from 9 contributors as they read their original writings, followed by a roundtable discussion with 4 of our participating readers. Our moderator is Lauren K. Johnson, author, editor, and veteran. Her connection to Proud to Be began as a contributor to Volume 1 and then as an essay judge to Volume 13. With her experience in military-focused writing and her connection to the series, Lauren will lead us on a thoughtful and engaging discussion. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone who made this volume possible, from the contributors to the judges, and to all of you tuning in tonight. A special thank you to our editor, Luke Rolfus of GreenTower Press at Northwest Missouri State University, who will introduce tonight's readers and panelists. Let's give Luke a virtual round of applause.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I will get things moving right along tonight since we have a full program. So I'm going to introduce all the readers. Our first reader of the night is Jason Green. Jason Green is a retired Army veteran of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. He holds a BA in multimedia journalism from UTEP and an MA in professional creative writing from the University of Denver. His nonfiction has been published in As You Were, The Military Review, Volume 16, Proud to Be, Volume 11, Potato Soup Journal, Best of 2023 Anthology, and Line of Advanced Literary Journal. His poetry has been featured in Scissortail Sings, Solitude and Friends, Winter 2022. Please welcome Jason Green.
Hello, everybody. So this is an essay that I wrote. I'm a 100% disabled veteran, and I wrote this piece just kind of exploring my scars, and then in turn the scars of the countries that I served in. So this piece is called Wondering. The sand of Iraq, seen the sand of Iraq, seen now only on satellite photos, matches the hue of my ever-expanding beer belly. There is the flight line where I sat recovering from a particularly harrowing trip while I watched crewmen power wash a dead soldier's blood out of the floor of a Black Hawk helicopter. There is the dining facility where we hid from rockets on a dusty day, as the nameless and faceless enemy fired blindly into our camp shortly after the election of the president we hoped would finally bring us all home. There is the scar that seemingly goes on forever from the burn pit where I spent day after day destroying anything I was asked to take there, and myself. My skin is the overhead view of Camp Tashi. The large scar on my lower right stomach from the open appendectomy and subsequent hematoma is in the general vicinity of my company's headquarters. The various scars from the laparoscopic removal of my gallbladder are, From left to right and west to east, the post office, the passenger terminal, the tank graveyard, and the containers where we slept. Up north, where I wear my CPAP to help keep me breathing at night, that's where the burn pit was. I have no outward scar to show for that one except the indentations on my face every morning until they dissipate after about 30 minutes. The satellite photo of Tashi shows that nothing has dissipated at the burn pit. The earth is scorched. There are miles of sand burned black. We left our mark in myriad ways over there. North of the burn pit, there is nothing. The camp has been emptied of almost every American piece of equipment that made up my makeshift hometown for 12 months back in 2008. On my body map, the north, my head is no longer a piece of government equipment. Since my retirement, I take a lot of pills each morning to deal with the PTSD from my deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. I waste time looking at things like satellite photos of the camps I was at over there and wondering if any of it was for anything. I waste time wondering which the US government destroyed more, the country of Iraq or me. Then I drink more beer to stop my mind from wandering back to the desert. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jason. That the essay Jason read was the winner of our essay contest in probably volume 13. Forgot to mention that. Thanks again, Jason. Next up is Renetta Van. Renetta Van explores identity and historical perspective issues in hybrid forms. Her work has appeared in The War Horse and Wrath-Bearing Tree, plus anthologies Sisters in Arms, Lessons We've Learned, and Things We Carry Still, poems and micro-stories about military gear. Van served as an analyst during her 36-year naval career, retiring as a captain. Please welcome Renetta Van.
Thank you, Missouri Humanities and GreenTower Press, for including my poems in spite of their long titles. I'm reading 2 poems as well as my signature close. I wrote How to Be a Woman Officer in homage to Tommy Orange's Like an Indian in his 2018 debut novel, They're There. Like Indigenous Americans, women in the military are still a minority, objects of curiosity and often invisible. How to Be a Woman Naval Officer in 1979, when only 2% of the Navy are women. It's important that she dress like a naval officer, drink like a naval officer, swear like a naval officer, behave like a naval officer, even if it's an act, even if she feels like a fraud the whole time, because the only way to be a naval officer in this man's Navy is to look and act like a naval officer. All the naval officers she knows are guys. The second poem bookends my 36 years in the Navy. When I was an officer candidate at Newport, Rhode Island, I remember marching by the docked ships as sailors yelled at me, "Join the Navy and ride a wave." Wave is an archaic term for women accepted for emergency volunteer service, 1942 to 1978. Join the Navy and ride a wave, yuckled a sailor from the brow. I marched, toes curling from stiff shoes, mirror finish showing gray skies, calves aching from running hard to stay up with November company, knees grinding from pounding concrete, just 6 false steps from marching today. Join the Navy and ride a wave, shrilled the sailor from the catwalk. After 30 years of service, sailors still cackle about waves. Writers clap, poets snap, readers turn pages. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Renetta. I like that ending that you gave. That's great. The third reader tonight is Blake Rondeau. Blake Rondeau is a United States Marine Corps veteran. His writing has appeared in the Summit Avenue Review. Rondeau has led writers' workshops for veterans transitioning into civilian life and finally learned to take his own advice. He's happiest walking in the woods with his wife, daughter, and dog. Please welcome Blake Rondeau.
Hello, all. Thank you again for the consideration of this poem and for allowing me to be here tonight. So the poem I'll read tonight is Gunline. Many people have told me that there are more stars in the sky than grains of sand in the desert. But how many worlds have I tossed into an empty can of skull sitting under a cami net? A gun line cold by the stagnant orders to hinder fire missions in the heat of the day. Each round, its own grain, each impact looking to find its wintergreen. Tossed with care, filling the void of time, bonding man to earth. Moving the planet with fingers and weapons, making craters, scars like the moon. War, the frenetic solar system, binding the only laws of nature we know.
Very good. Thanks so much, Blake. After Blake, we're going to go back and have another essay. This one is by Sin Kitchen. Sin Kitchen is the mother of a son who served in the USMC, including deployment during Operation Iraqi Freedom. She is an associate professor and chair of English at Knox College, where she teaches literature and creative writing. She is the author of a collection of short stories, 10 Tongues, and her poems and nonfiction appear in such places as American Writers Review, Poetry South, Poetry Quarterly, Fourth River, and Cutleaf. Sin has settled on an acre of prairie in downstate Illinois with her dog Doc, a couple of cats, and a small brood of chickens. Please welcome Sin Kitchen.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you for having me back in this edition of Proud to Be. This is an essay titled Living in River City. I used to live across the street from an Austrian lady. Hetty's home was haven for 300 plus birds. Cages lined every wall, and on summer days she would open her windows, allowing the rest of the neighborhood to hear the cacophonic soundtrack of her life. After we became neighbors, we'd wave to one another across the street, but seldom spoke. I was too busy with a house full of small children to make time for regular chats, until one day I found myself on her sidewalk retrieving a wayward child, drawn into conversation by her easy friendliness and mesmerizing storytelling. I grew up in Austria, she had said. I came to United States with Joe when he was a GI. Joe was the American soldier husband she had followed to the U.S. after they had met during World War II. By the time she and I spoke that day on the sidewalk, it had been decades since she had seen her homeland. We met during the war, she said, her thick accent sometimes difficult to understand. I had a brother, Joe, too, she added. He did not come home from the war. As she recalled her brother Joe, she took on a faraway stare. We lived in a neighborhood where everybody could see the uniformed men coming. They would watch the men holding papers coming down the street and wait for them to open someone's gate. That day, they opened our gate. I remember my mother. Hetty trailed off. Tears fell down to her cheeks, lip quivering. She shook her head as if to clear the images like stains that lingered there. I will never, as long as I live, forget the sounds my mother made that day. Then she took a deep breath and changed the subject. Her story made me uncomfortable. She was elderly, reliving a moment I couldn't possibly comprehend. Here I was, a 20-something-year-old mother trying to keep watch on little people climbing trees and chasing balls into the street. I struggled for something to say, but failed in my awkwardness and inadequacy. I probably said that I was sorry for her loss and then told her to enjoy the day as I trotted back home, wayward child in tow. But I've never forgotten her story. That conversation was decades ago, and I thought about her again this morning. The day was early yet, the street quiet, daylight not yet bright enough to extinguish the street lamps. I sat at my computer next to a window overlooking the street, sipping coffee, when a black vehicle pulled in front of my house and stopped at the curb. I didn't recognize the car and had no clue who it was or why they might have been there, and it unnerved me. Then, like a punch in the gut, I caught a wave of panic that 3, that's how many my son tells me there would be, uniforms might unfold from the doors of that black sedan and begin a somber walk up my pathway to the front door. For an agonizing instant, I choked on a consuming fear, like a presence that set me back in my chair. I knew that if indeed any uniforms emerged from that car, I would never make it to the front door to greet them. I dangled in that abyss for a few breathless moments, and then the car moved off the curb and proceeded on its way. My son had called from Iraq just 2 days ago, on Sunday evening. Could something have happened to him between then and now? When we had spoken that night, he'd sounded as exhausted as I'd ever heard him. Sorry I didn't call sooner, he had said. We've been in River City. Where's that? I asked. It means that Saturday morning somebody was killed and no calls were allowed in or out until the family was notified. This is the first chance I've had. That conversation crackled in my brain as I worked to return my panicked heart rate to normal. I thought about the flowers he had ordered for me that had arrived Sunday morning on Mother's Day. I thought about the mother somewhere else who may have been waiting on flowers or a phone call, but instead received a carload of uniforms. And I thought about Hetty's mother, her ululation, the unearthly news she had endured that day when uniforms opened her gate. I'm grateful beyond words that my son returned home from his service intact, but many do not. I hate war. I hate that so many have sacrificed so much. I'm also no longer the young, naive mother I once was. I'm old enough to have fought a few wars of my own and suffered a few casualties along the way. If I could have that conversation with Hetty over again, this time I'd invite her to sit at my table, hold her hand, share a cup of coffee, and shed a few tears right along with her.
Thanks so much, Sin. That essay, Living in River City, was an honorable mention in our essay contest this year. Next is KD Battle, and he's going to read us a sonnet, which, if you don't know what a sonnet is, it's basically just a 14-line poem that has a specific rhyme scheme. Shakespeare used to write a lot of them. So, KD Battle seeks life outside the lines. He is a Navy submarine veteran, a writer and composer of musical theater, and a writing instructor for all ages. He's taught for internationally recognized institutions like the Telling Room in Portland, Maine, and is currently the assistant director of first-year writing at Western Michigan University. His writing has been published and awarded in Writer's Digest, Vita Poetica, Proud to Be Volume 13, and Line of Advance, where he recently won the Colonel Darren L. Wright Award. Battle lives with his wife, son, and dogs, and he invites you to live a life of kindness, grit, and curiosity. Here's KD Battle.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Just wanted to thank Lisa, Lauren, and Luke for giving me the opportunity to read with all these amazing readers in this great. Expecting a sonnet, this is more of my only parameter right here, Luke. And I just wanted to say that I think this opportunity for us to write is really good because writing really helped me recontextualize my own service, which, for those of us who sometimes have a rocky exit to what we thought was a good service, it can really help. So this is Untitled Self-Help Sonnet about a submariner. I used to turn valves, big ass ones too, and I was good at it. Weird thing to get a nuclear certification for, the boat's lower level dungeon lord. My lungs filled with lube oil, cool bearings, shaft turning, propulsion, and power. I lived as a piston, making that submarine propeller spin through sweat. When we had reason to dive, seawater pumps big as VW bugs needed speed, called by uncle to push a button and turn valves in defense of national security. And God damn it, I smashed those buttons. Deep, clunky ones that broke fingers went shunk. Gronked actuators, fat as my jar head, all the clockwises until grease monkey biceps sang. Can't forget the baby powder smell of oxygen recycling, steam heat, whirring, and kashul. So loud. the symphony of 1,000 million machine cells operating as one body. We would tie a string tight across the engine room, drooping as we dove, sea-crushing hull. But when the boat was docked, I entered the heat exchanger naked, an inverse birth, to clean living seashells and blast barnacle buddies from condenser tubes with 5,000 psi. Hydrolancing, we called it. Scouring seawater lines so ka-chunk pumps kept us all alive. Thank you.
Thank you, KD. Our next piece is going to be a fictional story, and it's by Ali Watts. Ali Watts is a two-time OIF veteran trying to put everything the Army meant and still means to her down into words and seeing if that makes sense to anyone else along the way. A Wisconsinite living in Nebraska, she's got a disproportionate kinship with satire, tugboats, and underdogs, and will gladly listen to war stories all night long. Please help me in welcoming Ali Watts.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. I'll be reading some excerpts from a piece called Running Guns. It's a little bit of truth-based fiction, as probably all fiction really is, combining my own experiences and someone I once knew, their experiences, and probably several others who all discovered themselves young, or forever changed, forever conflicted, or connected because of it. Everyone knows the famous line, I never had around like the ones I had when I was 12. Jesus, does anyone? I disagree. My friends at 12 were fair weather most of the time, decent company keepers at best. My friends at 18, the ones I went to war with, now those were the friends to be reckoned with. You got the sentimentality, Stevie, I'll give you that, but the age is all wrong. Granted, I was 19 when I got there. In a unit of truck drivers, I wound up assigned to a role as a gunner because of my keen marksmanship, even though machine guns are primarily about suppressing and secondarily about actually hitting a target. We'd be running gun truck security for all sorts of convoys, which if you asked us wasn't as cool as what the big boys, the infantry, got to do. And if you asked the infantry, they'd say what they did wasn't as cool as what the special forces got to do. And if you asked the special forces, they'd say they never did anything cool at all. You don't think much about what you're doing when you're doing it. Me and everybody else on our deployment thought we were pretty insignificant in the bigger picture, just making the runs, pointing the guns, yank, yank. It was 13 years later when I ran into someone, an old Army friend who hadn't been on my deployment but was on their own around the same time, who looked at me like I was crazy for saying such a thing. They said we were running gun trucks in the gun truck war. We were the reason half the supply convoys like theirs made it home alive. I brushed it off as a ridiculously absurd thing to say, but it stuck with me anyway. Everyone wants to know they did something good, had a reason, there was a purpose for all what we went through, which didn't seem like all that much until it was. I had a hole growing inside of me, bleeding out slowly, and I didn't know how to fix it, or worse yet, if I even wanted to. There came a point where I considered not going home and staying there as part of those gun trucks forever, because I stopped feeling fear, and there's something a little crazy happening when someone no longer fears death. Like the line from The Revenant, the movie that finally got Leonardo DiCaprio his Oscar, I ain't afraid to die anymore. I'd done it already. None of them ever felt dead for good because they shouldn't have been. Even though we all knelt at the base of their memorials during their warside services and their things were shipped back to their families and halfway around the world funerals were held with full military honors. Even though we painted their names onto the concrete wall alongside our unit insignia and pictures of them were shared like valuable trading cards, and half of us started wearing that telltale black bracelet on our wrist as soon as we ourselves got back, it still didn't feel right. It was still a surprise they weren't also standing there alongside our families, waiting for us to return. I wanted to, but I never went back again. Maybe it's better that way. Maybe it's good I have that time, that year, with those people and nothing else to compare it to. It will always be the best and worst versions of me I'd ever been. I talk about the good times, about how some of the funnest, truest, and most important parts of my life happened over there with them. But that's even harder for someone to comprehend than the death. Running guns isn't a conversation I can have with most people because it's hard for someone who's never felt it to understand. Even with others who were there too, but not with me, the differences between how we did things kept our stories at a neighborly distance. There are only those friends I had then who knew exactly what I mean when I say the words I do. It's hard for people to grasp what the weight of 54 souls in a line of trucks feels like on 19-year-old shoulders. Granted, I was 20 by the time we came home.
Thank you, Allie. All right, next, we're going to go back to poetry, and we're going to hear from the poetry contest winner, and that is Lisa Wentz Connors. Lisa Wentz Connors retired as a master sergeant from the U.S. Army and is now a mercenary writer and poet. She divides her time between Salt Lake City, Utah, I think it's Fruita, Colorado, and the Open Road. She facilitates creative writing workshops for the Mesa County Public Library and the Grand Junction VA. She is the editor of High Desert Cadence, a journal of veteran poetry. Her work has been published in the journals Proud to Be, Alexandria Quarterly, Blue Stem Literary Journal, and Atlas and Alice, among others, as well as the anthologies Groundhogs, Crones, and Other Poems, and We Are the West, Tributaries. She has won a Missouri Humanities Poetry Award and 2 gold medals for poetry from the National Veterans Creative Arts Festival. Please welcome Lisa Wentz Connors.
Thank you, Luke. And thank you to Missouri Humanities for this opportunity. My poem is called Quiet Moments, and it's after a poem called Young Blossoms by Lee Young Lee. I was inspired by the line, "Death is nowhere in the background," in his poem about being a young child and remembering the taste of peaches. I'd had a bad deployment. It was my 8th deployment. And when I came home, I was struggling to rejoin the civilian world, and got into a poetry group and was introduced to this poem by Lee Young Lee. And so it reminded me that there were moments that were worth remembering. Quiet moments after Lee Young Lee. We dream languid days, but wake to the immediate. Rockets purr overhead, distant small arms fire. IEDs wait roadside, still living life in death's neighborhood, detaining scattered quiet moments, our souls POWs, never forgotten. A soldier plays guitar at dusk, a marigold in a coffee can, icy Coke with condensation at 113 degrees, pasta primavera MRE with honey roasted peanuts, letter folded in a pocket, read each time like the first, opening sweaty body armor to a cool breeze. Coffee and a cigarette, maybe even the right brand. 10 minutes alone, locked in the latrine. Going to shower, finding water, and it's warm. We dream languid days where death is nowhere in the background. Whole days, easy days, free for the taking or the leaving, and so easily forgotten. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. It was a treat to hear that aloud. I haven't read that Lee Young Lee poem in a long time, so I need to go back and revisit it. All right, so we're going to go back to another essay, and this is by James Wells. James B. Wells He's a retired criminology and criminal justice professor in the School of Justice Studies at Eastern Kentucky University, and is the recipient of the 2025 Academy of Criminal Justice Sciences John Howard Award, an award given intermittently upon significant demand to recognize an individual who has made significant and sustained contributions to the practice of corrections. A former carpenter, soldier, and correctional officer in a super maximum security prison, and later as a research planner assisting architects in prison design, he has multiple degrees, including an MS in criminal justice, a PhD in research, and an MFA in creative writing. Recent essays appear or are forthcoming in Collateral Journal, About Place Journal, Wild Roof Journal, Military Experience in the Arts, The Wrath-Bearing Tree, Shift, Proud to Be, Trajectory Journal, and From Pen to Page 3, More Writings from the Bluegrass Writers Coalition. His investigative memoir about his father's still classified death in Vietnam, it's called Because, a CIA cover-up and a son's odyssey to find the father he never knew, will be released on Father's Day weekend in 2025. Links to publications, presentations, blogs, etc. can be found at jamesbwells.com. James enjoys spending much of his leisure time with his spouse on their Lexington, Kentucky farm located on the Palisades of the Kentucky River. Please help me in welcoming James B. Wells.
Thank you, Luke, and thank you, Missouri Humanities. I'm going to read an essay whose origin I found quite by accident. The name of it is Our Savior. They say a person dies twice, once when they have their physical death, and the second time when we stop saying their name. Since you died over 70 years ago, odds are you were close to experiencing that second death if you hadn't already. But now, over 100 years after you gave my family life, I will resurrect yours. I was introduced to you in 2016 when scanning old black and white heirloom photographs belonging to my Aunt Etta at her home in Wheelersburg, Ohio. You were sitting in a wicker chair in front of a post-Victorian era photography backdrop. My grandfather was standing next to you with his hand on your shoulder. Both of you appeared to be in your early 20s. The suits the two of you were wearing suggested the photo's purpose was to mark an important event. When I removed the black cardboard back from the frame that held you and him hostage for who knows how many decades, I was surprised to see some writing on the back of the photo. Ora Wells, an war buddy who saved his life in battle, followed by your name. Next to Christ, who died for us all, this man was talked about as a savior. I recall feeling at the time an electric jolt going throughout my nervous system as if I had found some unexpected lost treasure. I remember wondering, why have I not heard of this story? And what powerful words! I could never explain it, but I sensed then that my grandfather was calling on me to tell and validate the importance of you sitting next to him. When I held the photograph up and showed my Aunt Etta its front and then flipped it to its back, she immediately recognized it and said with emotion your name, followed with, "My dad hadn't seen him in many years, and one day he walked in our back door." My Aunt Etta cried while telling me the story about how you pulled my grandfather out of a shelled and burning ammunition truck about to explode on the Western Front in World War I. She told me, "And Dad got all us kids together, sat us down in the living room, and said while describing you, 'This is the man that saved your daddy during the war.'" I never heard my aunt talk of someone like she did of you that day. She spoke of you in a very uncharacteristic, haltingly, almost childlike fashion. I will never forget her telling me. And I stood there and I looked at him and I looked at Daddy and thought, why he got in the fire to get my daddy. And we just kind of made a god out of him, you know. Later that summer, I made a trip to the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. I focused my efforts on obtaining information about you and my grandfather's involvement in World War I. I recall being mesmerized as I carefully separated brittle documents tightly bound into rolls with ribbon and opened them up for what I suspect was the first time. just as tiny broken shards of paper from nearly a century ago littered my modern reading room desk. I read about a World War I battlefield that combined weapons of war from two different eras, one with horse-drawn artillery and ammunition caissons, couriers, carrier pigeons, and bayonet charges, and another with ammunition trucks, telephone wire, poison gas attacks, machine gun nests, aerial balloons, and German aeroplanes that strafed American troops at will. From these archival documents, I learned that you and my grandfather grew up within a couple of blocks of each other in New Boston, Ohio. When the Great War started, both of you were found free of venereal disease and assigned to the same unit while in Camp Sherman. The two of you were found competent enough to drive Pierce aero trucks for the 308th Ammunition Train of the 158th Field Artillery Brigade, 83rd Division. From all the documents that listed your name and my grandfather's, I suspect both of you must have looked after each other at Camp Sherman, in trains and ships carrying you to war, and while you were fighting the Germans in France. I also discovered a battle after action report that made me believe it could have been the particular engagement responsible for the story my Aunt Etta told me. One September Sunday last year, I went looking for you. Thousands of your brethren greeted me as they stood in perfect and perpetual attention, while hundreds more lay prostrate, level with the ground. I spent several hours walking up and down, eyeing your brethren in long rows of freshly cut grass, still wet from the morning dew. Just as long tufts of wet grass covered my dockers, socks, and cuffs of my cargo pants, I suspect it also covered you. Time ran out, and I didn't find you. I later discovered that findagrave.com had misled me. I never found you because you were never there. You were in the cemetery next door. Today, almost a year later to the day, I finally found you. I brushed you off and sat down next to you. Learning from your obituary that you died at the early age of 57 after being in ill health for 6 years, I suspect I know what killed you. Remembering that every labored breath my grandfather took was a constant reminder of the harmful effects of what mustard gas can do, I suspect your exposure to the gas, perhaps when saving my grandfather, was a factor in killing you. I told you about my family and the legacy you left for us. When it came time to leave, I thanked you once again and left a single red rose to remind you of our visit. I hope to return soon with my grandson and granddaughter. Him finding you will be a memory he will never forget. He'll meet the man responsible for his great-grandfather's life as well as his own. Over 100 years ago, you gave my family and me life. Now, more than 70 years after your death, I give you life. Thank you, Francis Oliver Crabtree.
Thanks, James. Okay, we have one more reader tonight, and then we'll move on to the roundtable. Our final reader is Kresha Richmond Warnock, and she's going to read an essay for us, and this was an honorable mention in our essay contest. So Kresha Richmond Warnock is a writer living in the Pacific Northwest with her husband. She is writing a memoir contrasting her days as a campus radical to her current role as the mother of a police officer. During the Iraq War, her son served in the U.S. infantry and was deployed twice to Iraq. Kresha's essays have been published in the Brevity blog, Amethyst Review, Remington Review, Persimmon Tree, Moss Piglet, Jewish Women of Words, Fomadin, Instant Noodles, and the anthologies Pure Slush and American Writers Review 2022. For a complete list of her writing, please visit her website, KreshaRWarnock.com, or follow her on Instagram at KreshaRWarnock, or on Twitter/X at KRWWriter. Please welcome Kresha Warnock.
To me, this essay is called The Survivor. Marion, Indiana is a struggling Rust Belt town upstate Route 69 from Indianapolis. The Mississinawa River is the prettiest geographic feature of the city, and Matter Park stretches for green miles along it. Marion was my home for 17 years. Most days, I walked along the river looking for blue herons standing on one leg in the shallows. Then I crossed over a little hill in the park to visit a memorial to the young soldiers who died in Iraq and Afghanistan. I wandered along the curved pathway and said a silent prayer for each of the dead boys represented by the 8 plaques that lined its brick sidewalk. During Christmas break 2006, on a cold December afternoon, my husband Jim and I had gone to see a matinee of Daniel Craig in Casino Royale. We just got home and we're standing in our kitchen, lavender walls, robin egg blue trim. The late afternoon winter light filtered through the big window, looking out on the giant leafless hickory tree. The phone call came to my husband's cell. Your son's Humvee was hit by an IED. David has been taken to the hospital here in Baghdad and will be transferred out to Germany tomorrow. Jim, my husband, crumpled. He leaned into me. I was all that was supporting his 6-foot frame from falling. I knew this would happen. They asked if we had passports. If they fly you over, that means he's dying. The only time I'd seen my husband cry in our 40 years of marriage. David had been the driver of a Humvee. The force of the blast drove his jaw into the radio on the dashboard in front of him. David's best friend Gustavo was in a Humvee right behind. He jumped out and cradled my son's head in his arms, whispering, "Don't die, don't die," until the medics got there. I only can imagine the twisted rubble, the smell of burning, the screams, the chaos. My boy. Sergeant Lawrence Carter, manning the gun turret, didn't make it. His father never got to hear from their son again. He was 25. When they rescued these wounded soldiers, Carter's blood was splattered all over David. Maybe that's why they thought David was mortally wounded. I wanted to write Carter's mother, but didn't know what to say. It's more than 15 years later. I never even found her address. I do not have the courage to walk into her pain. I tell myself it wouldn't do any good. That first night after the phone call, I felt nothing. I could say I knew David would be okay, but that's not true. Jim and I were both still awake, not talking, lying side by side in our brass bed when David's call came at 4 a.m., groggy but alive. He'd lost his phone and needed his girlfriend's number. The next day, he was transported to Germany, his jaw broken in several places, shrapnel in his back. His girlfriend's mother fed him soup through his wired shut jaw until he was strong enough to travel back home. We picked him up in Chicago, drove back down to Marion, and put him to sleep in his childhood bedroom, also with a wintry view of the old hickory tree. In 3 weeks, he was back in Germany on light duty till he returned to Iraq for his second deployment a year later. When I walked through the memorial in Marion, I was thankful that the sculpture of the empty boots didn't represent David's. I know little but the engraved information on most of the Indiana boys commemorated there, but it's a small region and there are always connections. The name on the first plaque is Corporal Lance Thompson, a Marine killed in the invasion of Baghdad in 2003. A dear friend is married to his cousin, another Marine. Lance was 20 when he died, too young to be a father yet. My friend brings her 2 little ones to visit and keep his memory in their hearts. First Sergeant Colin Bowen's plaque is further along the path. He suffered burns over 50% of his body when his vehicle was blown up in Afghanistan a year after David's injury. I felt it my duty to follow his 72-day grueling death march on the website his brother set up for him. They were a religious family. They wanted us praying as Colin's life waned. We heard how he kissed his wife through the bandages that covered him for the last time. Neither prayers nor doctors could save him. He was old enough to leave a little daughter behind. God willing, I will follow the natural order and die before my children, but I will never overcome that terror when I let myself imagine what might have been. When David was home for those few weeks of R&R, friends would say to him, "You are really lucky." If I was really lucky, he responded, I wouldn't have been blown up at all. Luck, fate, God's will, whatever, that IED blast will forever reverberate in my soul. I will always wonder who I would have become if David hadn't made it home.
Thank you, Krisha. All right, that was the last of the readers of the night. Can we do one more, I don't know, virtual round of applause or something for all the wonderful readers tonight, please? Okay. I really loved how varied those readings were. Like they were all completely different, and it was just wonderful to hear everybody's voice in real life or whatever, in real Zoom life, whatever this is. We're going to switch gears here and move over to the round table, but before we do that, I want to introduce the host of the round table, which is the terrific Lauren K. Johnson. So let me just read Lauren's bio here. Lauren K. Johnson is the author of the memoir The Fine Art of Camouflage from Millspeak Books, and which chronicles her coming of age against the backdrop of war, beginning with her mother's Army career in deployment in support of Operation Desert Storm when Laura was 7 years old, and later with her own service in Afghanistan. The book was named an IBPA Benjamin Franklin Award Silver Medal winner and a finalist for the Forward Indies Book of the Year Awards and the Eric Hoffer Book Award. Lauren's writing has been featured in the Washington Post, The Atlantic, Boston Globe Magazine, Glamour, Yale Medicine Magazine, and elsewhere. And I really like this detail. One of her very first publications was in Proud to Be Writing by American Warriors, Volume 1. She is a writing consultant with Grub Street and an editor at the Wrath Bearing Tree. She lives with her husband, twin daughters, and two fat cats outside Seattle. So I'm going to turn things over to Lauren K. Johnson.
Thank you so much, Luke. It is really a pleasure for me to be here tonight. Very much a full circle moment, given that one of my very first publications was 13 years ago in Proud to Be Volume 1. And I really credit the military writing community in the last decade plus to so much of my own personal growth and healing. And that's really a testament to folks like Missouri Humanities and Luke and Lisa and the Proud to Be series for creating spaces like this where we can all come together and build community through storytelling. So I just want to give a big shout out and a big thank you to all of the people here who are doing that. I know I saw some folks in the audience, Tracy Crow, Randy Brown, a lot of others who are working to build those spaces as well. When I was asked to moderate today's discussion, I took the opportunity to look back at Proud to Be Volume 1 and enjoyed reading the foreword by decorated World War II veteran and author Lawrence E. Breeze, who shared something that really resonated with me as both a veteran and a military daughter as well. He wrote, "The circumstances and characteristics of our wars may be markedly different, and society and times are decidedly dissimilar, yet there is much in common that brings us all together." And he hit on something here that I really love about military writing and something that this Proud to Be series captures brilliantly, which is the way that it highlights all the connective threads of war. I think we saw that reflected in a lot of the stories that we heard tonight. And Luke, as you mentioned, so many vastly different perspectives, all speaking around this huge looming topic of war. So I'd like to turn it over to the panelists now and ask you all to reflect on that. Despite these different perspectives that you have, do you feel your pieces speak to similar themes? And if so, what value does that have both for those within and outside the military community? Fire away, Jason.
Yeah, I think it all veteran writing holds value, especially in a world where sometimes we might be called, suckers or losers. But I think it's important to share our stories, and there's so many different perspectives here in the book that I mean, I hear it from my mom, but I don't think she even fully tells me the whole story, or my wife, of what they went through while I was gone. So just so many different perspectives, and hearing everything is it's really important to keep those stories out there, and uh, you know keep them in the world.
Thank you,
Can I say something?
Jason. Yeah, go ahead, Krisha.
First of all, I'm not trying to guilt trip you, Jason. um, yeah, being, I mean, I respect the military so much, and those who have served, and those who are military wives and military or spouses and military families. And being a military mom is a little bit different. You're not quite in the same mix. So I really appreciate being allowed to. Well, yeah, I appreciate having my point of view heard here, and hearing everything else that's being read. In terms of community, of bringing the world together, my husband who served in the Coast Guard in during Vietnam said, that was a time when people got to know each other across different cultural barriers and so on. And I think that's true. And I think that living in Indiana, when I'm a West Coast girl, I grew up in Seattle and so on, but living in Indiana for 17 years, I was very fortunate to be in that community when David was serving, because there was a greater empathy, I think, for the veteran community, and for the guys the people that were deployed. And so, yeah, I think that that this kind of writing is important because because people need to know what other people are thinking and feeling and living.
Yeah, if I may too, with that, I think you need multiple voices because this is more of a puzzle than right, than just one little piece of one story defining every little thing, because I found myself in Jason's story, in Allie's story, in Lisa's story, in KD's, in in different parts, and not all of them were the same. Different parts. I've never been in a submarine, but I have been on ship for 9 months, right? I've also been in the middle of the desert for, so it's, I think you can't summate uh your whole tenure, whether it's 4 years or whether it's 40 years in the service, by just having one story. And so I don't think um just reading one author or just reading one story is going to do that. And so I think it's wonderful when you have the civilian, um and the the spouses or significant others of family members, as well as veterans, sharing everything, because it just kind of imbricates a greater story for what this war has done, or other wars, and how they've impacted this war.
To build on what Blake was saying, not only could I relate to what all the other veterans were saying here, but also there's a continuity because I can read back stories about Korea or World War II, even all the way back the Civil War. There are things that are universal that soldiers experience. And I think that other than maybe first responders, it's kind of unique to the military world, and people people can't understand that unless they hear it from those veterans themselves. So we have to keep writing.
I'd also add that the storytelling is important. I I went through a semi inpatient treatment for PTSD at one point, and they told me that the guys coming back from World War II and some of the other wars, World War One, came back on ships, and they had time to kind of sit around and tell stories to each other, talk about things, and it was a little bit of time to unwind and kind of be with people who had been there. And honestly, nowadays we don't have that. We leave the war zone, and 2 days later we're home, or the next day we're home. And so I think sharing these stories gives us a chance to bond with one another, and getting to read each other's stories. Like Blake said, you get a little bit of your story and everybody's story.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful comments, everyone. I think you really highlighted not just the connective power of the military experience, but the connective power of storytelling. And I think to take it even a step further, the connective power of just being a human. And so much of that comes across in all of these pieces as well. It is a unique military story, but there's also a lot of just real human emotion underlying all of it, and that forms a really powerful thread through all of these as well. So thank you to this amazing comment here from Dave about the necessary nature of these stories for everyone to hear. And my hope is always that folks who don't share these experiences will not only learn something, but that they'll find something they can connect within them as well. So jumping now to the current anthology, which, just another plug, you get 20% off on this beautiful book. So definitely check it out, read all of these stories and more. The foreword to this anthology was written by Jeffrey Hess, who is a Navy veteran, the author of 8 books. Totally ridiculous, I know. Editor of 2 military anthologies, and he also leads writing workshops for military veterans and family members. And in his foreword, he calls writing an act of making oneself vulnerable. And then he comments that this is particularly challenging for veterans because the military isn't really known for encouraging vulnerability. And then I would add that you all gave an extra layer of vulnerability because you didn't just write your stories, but you shared your work publicly by publishing them in a book and then coming to this venue to read them out loud and to talk about them here on the panel. So what drove you each to be vulnerable and write and then also share about the military experience?
I think for me, once I got out of the military, I went to college with the GI Bill and started taking a lot of writing classes. And I didn't have much to write about other than what I had been through. And I was going through therapy at the time, and I was encouraged to write, to get it all out. And I think the response I got from people that had and hadn't been there was plenty of other veterans in school, but I think the response I got kind of encouraged me to get my writing out there, and it's definitely an act of courage, secondary courage. It's just sending it out and seeing what happens.
I didn't intend to write about my military service. Like I said, earlier, I had a really bad deployment as the last thing I did before retirement. It was come back and guess what? You're free. So, I found this poetry group at the library, these civilians, and started taking the class, and it turned out to be a write what you know situation. And having been retired from the military, I had spent my entire adult life in the service, and I didn't know anything else. I was a service member. I was a military wife. We lived on base. I didn't know anything else as an adult in the real world. And so I write what I know.
Yeah, I think I didn't start out writing about military service at all. For me, it was a chapter in a book that I intended to close and never really revisit. And then I went to school and got an English degree, and then started teaching a couple of writing courses, and was really helping veterans get get their stories down, particularly with my local VA, because they were having problem getting Vietnam vets service connected for PTSD because they wouldn't talk about it. They had no record about it. They wouldn't know how to talk about it, etc. So through a lot of these prompts, because a lot of people look at poetry and go, I don't know poetry. I don't understand it. and then you kind of give them a feeling or a place or a something, and then they'll start writing. Well, in that time, I also had 30 minutes to write, or 15 or whatever. And then if I'm going to sit there, I might as well make use of my own time during those things. And all of a sudden, my own poetry kind of started to come that way. And I think it was also that community, right? Those people were vulnerable in that moment and sharing stories. I couldn't just be like, well, I'm the teacher, I don't need to share, anything. So it felt cheap to do that. So then I would start to kind of discuss my own things and realize, oh, there's kernels here that apply in multiple ways. And so I started tinkering with all of that.
Well, I didn't go to school to go. I mean, I started writing in my creative writing in my 70s. So sorry, guys. And I started writing memoir, and I started writing, and this period in my life when my son was in the military was so pivotal that I had to write something about it. But I think that that more than that, kind of what my concern is the polarization of our country, or people are so siloed, and I think it's really important. I was demonstrating against the Iraq War while my son was serving in Iraq. I hope that doesn't offend anybody, but I totally respect his work and your work. But it's that we need to find ways to communicate what people's experiences are, but the lived experiences of the military, but also their families are. So I think that's important in humanizing everybody.
Humanizing everybody. Yeah, absolutely. War is a very big and political and economic and all of these like huge earth-shattering themes, and bringing it down to the individual level and reminding everyone that these are people with emotions and with families is such an important aspect of this storytelling. I think that's actually a really great segue into the next question. We've gotten some audience Q&As. Thank you, those of you who've submitted questions. Everyone else, feel free to do so as well through the Q&A tab. So someone has asked, I noticed that the readers write about themselves for the most part, and I wonder if they write about the things that influence the military as a whole, or the particulars of their duty stations, etc. So almost zooming out, and also zooming in at a very microscopic level in writing as well. Any of the panelists want to jump in there? Other realms outside the personal that you write about? Lisa, I think you actually did that really well in your poem. If you feel comfortable jumping in.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I have written several poems that are not from my personal point of view, where I try to use the word we, because I'm trying to encompass our whole experience. I don't think there are many people who went to the desert that can't feel those moments that I was talking about there. They're not individual to myself. I was told once by a poetry teacher that Americans generally don't win the big international prizes for poetry because we always write about ourselves, whereas the Europeans write about huge experiences like World War II and that sort of thing, and we always write about something incredibly personal. And so I've tried to take the I out of most of my poems.
Thank you, Lisa. It's really good advice for anyone out there who's seeking an international poetry award too.
That's right.
I don't know.
Any other?
I got into
Yeah,
writing.
go ahead, Jason.
I got into writing just to write about myself. Vain like that. No, I'm just kidding. I think like the essay that I had in this book, it kind of starts off in a micro sense and then backs out to more of a macro. It looks at me and my situation, and then I always like to kind of take a broader look at things and how, you know, what did the army do to me personally, but then what did we do to the country of Iraq, kind of thing. That's this particular piece. So I always try to take a bigger look at the bigger picture, kind of thing.
And there's a great comment from Sarah too. Telling your story is definitely a way to tell a larger story. Absolutely. And you know, individual stories all take place in a specific cultural context. So that's something that I love about a lot of the pieces featured in this anthology too, is that they're kind of capturing a moment in history where it's very personal, but it also, you know, represents, you know, a milestone in our evolution of humanity. And then again, you have those rippled effects that go throughout history that are shared among different eras of war as well. I think we've got time for maybe a couple more questions, so try to address some others in the Q&A here. So a really great one from Tara. Understanding there was catharsis involved in your pieces, did any of you experience anything unexpected on an emotional level that surprised you as you were writing?
I told my writing group I was really afraid I was going to start crying during mine when I was reading it on the panel, but yeah.
Did you have that experience while you were writing it as well, Kresha? Did you feel that swell of emotion?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I wrote it 3 or 4 years ago, but yeah, I did.
I'd say this particular piece, I finished it up just before I sent it in to the contest, and I just recently found a note in my phone that I had written maybe 5 or 6 years before about, hey, you should write an essay about your body and compare it to, you know, the base that you were at. So I sat on it for a really long time because I didn't want to write it. It was going to be tough, and I knew it. So I think there's always catharsis involved. It's always something that makes you learn something about yourself, whether you want to or you're scared of it, or, you know, stuff you got to get out. So.
Yeah, definitely. I don't know how emotional it was for me, but it was certainly a realization to realize that how anti-war I was. I didn't feel like I was, and then all of a sudden I was reading, or you know, I was rereading the things that I had written, and they were kind of surprising when I was being honest with myself, and then kind of having the nerves to put that out for family and friends of mine to see, you know, and how they would take you know, some of this, and not necessarily particularly what is in this anthology, but just other snippets out there. But it was certainly a revelation for me on, oh, people may not see it this way or the way that I do, or anything of that. And I think that also just comes from time and away from my experience.
There's another poem in this anthology called that I wrote called One by One, which is very personal. It's about the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I wrote that in a moment of rage and fury and snot-covered ugly crying. And that surprised me. First, that I felt such a strong emotion just watching it on television, but also that that I was able to write like that.
a lot of hearkening back to the themes of vulnerability, almost like vulnerability is a necessary prerequisite to finding that catharsis. Unless you let yourself be vulnerable and really go there and dig into it, then it's hard to get to that space. So thank you all for, again, being vulnerable and sharing your answers there. Just looking at the time, Lisa, looks like we may be ready to wrap up. Apologize that we didn't get to all the questions in the Q&A. Panelists, please feel free to jump in and type some answers too. I will say there's a question about what can we say instead of thank you for your service, which Lisa and I were actually spitballing that we could probably do a whole panel on that. So great question. Again, panelists, feel free to type your answers, and just thank you all so much for being here today. Readers, panelists, audience members, this has been a really wonderful space to be vulnerable with you all.
Thank you so much, Luke, for all the great introductions to our readers and panelists, for taking the virtual stage. Special thanks to Lauren for moderating this and for being a continued supporter of Proud to Be. It was so nice looking at the attendee list, and I saw multiple fans of Proud to Be and people that have been contributing over the years. So thank you for coming out tonight and supporting your fellow veteran writers, your fellow veteran moms. Thank you to everyone who came out tonight and support and participated in the conversation and rallied our writers. It is very much appreciated, and we are so honored that we get to have a stage for these conversations and for these readings. Stay in touch with us by following us at social media at Mo Humanities. Become a member, join our email. We'll update you when PTB 14 comes out. Submissions are open for that right now, so please pass that along to anyone you might think would be interested in submitting. We sincerely hope you enjoyed the evening and feel inspired to pick up your very own copy of Proud to Be. Thank you so much, everybody.